Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Nonprofit Show. You know, there are days when I think that the most interesting conversation of the day happens in the green room before we ever get started. And so we've had a great conversation already before we even went live with our guest and our co-host. So I know today's going to be a barn burner. We're going to be talking about why strategic plans fail and how to plan for success and not failure. I'm here with the amazing Nico Marquette Whitlock, one of our tremendous co-hosts. And we are talking today with Doug Paul of Catapult. This is such a big topic because we're in a time of tremendous change on many levels. And so strategic plans are kind of like love them or hate them. You do anyway, I think, but especially now when we have so many things going on. You know, one of the things that we have going on are our amazing presenting sponsors. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Fridays. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy, here today with my amazing friend, Nico Marquette Whitlock, coming to us from Atlanta. He's known as the mindful techie. I think he's just like a mindful, soulful person. So welcome, my friend.
Thank you for having me. Excited for this conversation.
I really am too. Nico and I are going to be talking today with Doug Paul, Managing Partner, Innovation Strategist at Catapult. Catapult is a great word on so many levels, Doug, but talk to us about what Catapult does.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit there in the tagline where we talk about we want to be rocket fuel for nonprofits, but Catapult in many ways is not actually talking about the medieval weapon that throws things. It's actually talking about the engineering system that is underneath an aircraft carrier, where you can see basically 6 inches of steel that the airplane will attach to, but what's underneath the deck is going to be a machine that's the size of 2 semi-trucks. And so that's the way that we want to think about ourselves, is like we don't need to be seen at all. All you're going to see is that like 6 inches of steel, but underneath this is a lot of bandwidth and a lot of lift with a lot of experience in helping nonprofits.
Wow. I love that. I think that's amazing. And if you've ever seen any of those jets thrown off of an aircraft carrier, it's intense. I mean, if you've just seen it on film, I'm not even saying witnessing it live, just I mean, wow! I love this concept, and so let's get into it. Miko, I'll have you get us started off.
Absolutely. So I guess as a starting point, I want to talk about vision and reality. But even before we do that, can we just do like a level set, like very quick elevator pitch? Like, what is a strategic plan, and why do we need one?
Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. If we're going to talk about strategic plans, so. You would think that the answer to that is within the title itself. Unfortunately, a lot of times that we're seeing with nonprofits, that isn't necessarily the case. You need a strategy. So how are you going to get from A, where you are now, to B, the future? So that would be the vision. And your plan is how you plan to get from A, where you are now, to B. Sort of the way that we talk about vision, it's the preferred picture of the future. And so a strategy is this one unified statement of like, we believe if we do blank, then blank will happen. So strategy is always a hypothesis. It is Mark Pollard talks about how it is a informed opinion about how to win. And so that is really important in that there's no guarantee that the strategy is right, but it's our best educated guess about how we plan on getting from A to B.
So in other words, it's a great idea right now on paper, maybe. On your digital vision board. And so how do we bridge the gap between that and reality? Do they work together? Is there tension? Like, can you describe when we talk about vision versus reality, like, how do we navigate this with our strategic plans?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, I think one of the things that we see in working with nonprofit leaders regularly is a lot of times you have like these really, really visionary leaders. They have the capacity for belief, both in the mission as well as in themselves. And I mean that as a positive. I don't mean that as like a narcissistic thing. But what that does oftentimes, and I would throw myself into this category, is we can be a little bit more pie in the sky about the vision. And so the things that we do when we're working with folks is really do something called assumptions mapping, where what are the assumptions that we're making that if we're wrong about will undermine the vision, that will undermine the strategy and the plan from working. And that requires that we take a little bit of time to pause, to sort of like pump the brakes. Let's pause on planning and actually like, what are the assumptions that work here? And let's push them, press them, prod them a little bit to make sure that we actually have the best version of our strategy and maybe not just like the first iteration of it.
So with the assumptions, is it partly thinking about the ways that something might go wrong or fail? You know, I asked this question in the context of a strategy that I've heard about in terms of project planning, where in order to build the best product or, you know, make sure that the project goes as well as it can, you actually spend time with your team actually thinking through, okay, well, what are the ways that this plan could actually fail? And you sort of begin to work backwards from that to address those assumptions that you were talking about.
Exactly. I mean, like one way of thinking about it is doing something called a pre-mortem, where if this project were to fail, how would it die?
Yes.
And then how would, like, because all we're talking about is obstacles. So what are the obstacles at work from A to B? And a good coherent strategy is going to deal with those significant obstacles. And again, I think because we're so excited and we're so enlivened by the mission and the heart for what it is that we're doing and the mission moving forward, sometimes it takes a level of self-discipline in a leader, particularly high impact leaders, to pause a little and to do some of that heavy lifting and hard work.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So part of this is then, you know, I think of like the moniker flexible thinker, and being flexible. Wow, we are what, 6, 7, not even 8 weeks into a new federal president administration with a lot of chaos in the federal government. That's requiring flexibility.
Yeah.
How do we build for something that we can't even imagine is going to come down the pike?
Well, I mean, I think depending on who you talk to, I don't know that lots of people would say this is a black swan event.
Correct.
So like I've got a good friend that we've been working with and they lost 60% of their funding on the third week for the nonprofit that was attached to USAID. And so that they've been planning for that for 9 months, not knowing who was going to win the election, but there was some pre-planning they could do. I think part of the way that we can build in flexibility though is when we're building our actual plans, we are not building them in such a way that they are brittle, that if one significant thing goes wrong, the whole thing breaks. And I think that is actually a systemic problem with some of our strategic planning processes, is they are built on 50, 60, 70-year-old ways of planning that work for a world that no longer exists. And so we need much more flexible templates for how we're thinking about planning, how we're refreshing every 90 days or every year, that actually bakes in learning, that bakes in a world that is changing and allows us to actually like iterate and move forward and actually think that's normal and not think that we've missed something because of that. That's the world we live in now.
So how do we shift to that? I mean, I know that as someone who's managed complex IT projects, for example, you always build in flexibility around budget, right? You build in flexibility around staffing. You build in flexibility around the fact that, okay, well, if this vendor doesn't work out, then what's my backup plan? And so I'm curious, how do we get organizations when they think about sort of in the broadest sense strategic planning, how do we sort of build this type of planning or like risk management into that process?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, I think, you know, Adam Grant talks about how one of the key aspects for people who are some of the most like forward thinking is they're actually the best risk mitigators. We think about entrepreneurs and we think about they're the riskiest people, but in fact, when you study them, they're actually the most risk averse people. They're just very, very good at planning and finding the alchemy between what's happening in the present and the constraints of the present and where the future is going and where you should be hedging your bets. And so I think one of the keys, it's going to sound like I'm sidestepping your question, but I promise you I'm not. I think one of the things is we've got to change a little bit of the culture that exists within nonprofits to be much more comfortable with doing R&D and doing it on the side. And so like there's a writer you're probably familiar with named Nassim Taleb. He wrote The Black Swan, which makes sense for this conversation, as well as the book Anti-Fragile. And he talked about like somewhere between 10 and 15% of your time, your energy, and your resources should be going into projects that like you're expecting them to fail. But you are expecting that the learning from that for the one thing that'll hit, because every once in a while, one of those things is going to hit, and it's going to hit big. That is actually the edges of the future that are going to become your reality. And so we need more of that kind of like innovative culture on the edges of our nonprofits that over time make their way into our plans, because every once in a while, we're going to find something that really, really hits.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And, you know, one of the things that comes to mind is that part of the constraint for nonprofits is actually funders, right? Funders are risk averse, right? And so funders tend to fund for now, for this moment, and they're not thinking about beyond that, right? Because they're trying to conserve what they have, right? And so I think there's also maybe a culture shift that can happen in philanthropy in terms of how we think about big, bold bets, and how we can, you know, we can be strategic and manage risk, but how do we build in what you're talking about in terms of the R&D and the sort of the innovation that requires failure, right? In order to be able to figure out how do we accelerate from this moment to sort of the next big, you know, generational shift thing.
Right.
And I think with some of that we can segment the ask with the donor. There are some people, like what Taleb says is like, for the 85% of the stuff that your time, energy, and resources are going to, you want to double down on the safest. Like, so think about the programs that have worked for 20, 25 years and they keep delivering. There are donors who that's what they want to give to. They are based on, they're giving to predictable ROI. But there are other people who are used to being asked for money because they have a lot of it. They're high net worth individuals, but they're also entrepreneurial.
Yes.
And so they don't understand why a nonprofit like is working with them in a way that they aren't thinking entrepreneurially as well. And so I do think there's a way of segmenting some of our asks to the donor who is sitting in front of us, and in almost having like different donor classes based on what it is that they want to see as the outcome of their charitable donation.
I agree with you. I think there's, you know, where does big thinking and creative thinking live? And I think that's a huge piece of this. I want to get to the next aspect of our conversation, and that's closing the execution gap, because I think this follows in line with what you're saying. You know, big ideas, actionable steps. What is something that's like a stewardship step versus, to your point, that big idea, that really explosive concept that will rattle some cages. So how do we kind of look at this?
I feel like this is the big hairy ball of wax that lots of nonprofits are running into. Because what we're talking about is the cultural reality that we see in many nonprofits, not all, but in many, which is you've got a group of people that have been willing to take significantly less money. I'm not saying that's what we want for them, or what we would like sector-wide, but it is the reality that we currently live in, where people can take a 30 to 40% passion pay cut just to get to do what it is that they feel passionate about. But coupled with that is the belief that they should have freedom as well. And there's this almost like friction between those two things. We've got passion and freedom, but we need to have impact and accountability at the same time. And I think a lot of leaders who are founders struggle to do the accountability part of that culture. That's a really important aspect. So that, I mean, it's just a simple thing. Like you said, you were going to do X hasn't happened. Let's talk about that. In the same way that would be very normal in the business sector, I think there is a little bit of fear and anxiety and trepidation and a cultural reality within nonprofits. So the first piece of that question is the culture aspect. The second one is we need to have bite-sized KPIs that allow us to really look at whether or not things are going forward. We should have lead measures like the inputs and outputs, the lag measures, to really determine whether or not we are on track. We should have a 360-degree snapshot of how the organization is doing and how our impact is doing. Yeah. And that really, really is a big piece of like having actionable, bite-sized key performance indicators in our strategic plan.
Yes,
Okay.
and I think so. I would say that from my experience, part of the challenge with that is that with organizations that depend on external funding, generally sometimes there's a misalignment between the real impact that an organization is having and what a funder is asking for, right? In terms of how they report, right? And so there's a disconnect between that, and there's sort of a double duty that's happening where the folks that are on the ground that are doing the work, they're very smart, they're very resourceful, they know how to do a whole lot with less. They can see what's happening, right? That they're pretty adept at sort of capturing that. But I think sometimes what we see is that on the funding side, there's a disconnect, right? Because funders want to see something that's shiny and tangible that they can sort of put in their annual report and take a photo of, and that doesn't always neatly align with what actual real meaningful durable impact looks like. So I think that's another factor that contributes to sort of what you're talking about with this execution gap.
And I think this is sort of like a best practice that we've tripped into, kind of doing strategic planning for a little north of 1,300 organizations. And it doesn't work for every nonprofit, but for nonprofits who are able to get their funders to participate in the strategic planning process, there is something that is unlocked when they actually are experiencing the move from what is to what could be to what will be. The what is, when we're doing the analysis and they're actually seeing and hearing like the difficulty in the everyday 1 foot off the ground, boots on the ground reality of what the nonprofit is experiencing. To like, because funders like to give to big shiny things, like you were just saying, things that oftentimes like you can see and you can touch. That's why capital campaigns are so exciting. There's brick and mortar like electricity there. But if you can get them in a multi-month process that engages both their brain and their heart before you're asking for their checkbook, there's this principle of what you co-create, people will own and feel responsible for. And so you can unlock their vision for what their money can do if they're part of the process. Now, you can't always do that. And for grants, it's difficult to do that. For federal funding, it's difficult to do that. But for high net worth individuals, for people who are building a network around those, having some key stakeholders who are part of that and then become ambassadors to their friends of other high net worth individuals for that, we found has been like really helpful. And not just doing visioneering and strategy and the planning with that, but also raising money at the same time, which is always, if we can hit 3 birds with 1 stone, let's do that.
Not the birds, though.
Not the birds. Yeah, this is what we need. So talk to us a little bit about then, we understand how we can have different outcomes and we can be measuring and looking at them and everything. How do we pivot when we have to? Like, do we go back and say to these stakeholders, our teams, our boards, our major donors, wow, we need to pivot, we need to change? And how do we manage that with this without looking like we're failing?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And again, part of this is how you frame it. I think one of the ways that we poorly do this is when we cast vision for something and explain the plan, we explain it in such a way that this will 100% work exactly as we have stated, rather than saying 10 years out is fuzzy. And the way that vision works is that if I'm 10 miles away from a cylinder, it looks like a square, but the closer I get to it, the more definition there is. And so the closer I get to a vision that I'm trying to achieve, the more definition there's going to be. And so even the plan itself, as we get further out, we should be more open-handed with it. And as we get closer to 90 days or a year out or 18 months out, we should be more close-handed with it. And so there needs to be, in the way that we talk about it, like if we're saying, hey, we've got these 4 or 5 key focus categories 3 years out, the way that we are going to get to those is there are things that we're going to do in the first 12 to 18 months that are going to largely inform how we get to those focus areas. And so we can be a little bit broader in the articulation of our 3-year milestones and far more specific in our 90-day and 1-year goals, so that it leaves us some flexibility to learn, to iterate. And again, if we frame it that way, that makes all the sense in the world. We just have to do it a little bit differently than we've been doing vision casting in the past.
Right. So Miko, I'm going to switch this to you, because the next thing I want to talk about as our time kind of starts to draw is the evolution of living with, and I don't even like using the word failure, but I really love the word resilience. And as you, as the mindful techie and understanding mindfulness more than anyone else I know, but to a higher degree, what does resilience look to you like? And then Doug, I'd like for you to follow up on the resilience with the strategic planning that's needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think often when we traditionally think of resilience, we think about the ability to really bounce back from a challenge or a tough time. And one of the, I guess, limitations with that traditional way of thinking about resilience is that it's the idea that you're bouncing back or going back to the status quo or to what was before, when what we want to be doing is actually growing and evolving and learning, right? And so when I think about this idea of resilience, it's not just something that happens in the context of responding to a challenge, right? It's something that we don't have to wait for a challenge to cultivate and to practice resilience. Resilience is really about our ability to be able to skillfully navigate whatever we are experiencing in life and work, and to be able to do it in a way that we are continuously growing and evolving. In the organizational context, you might maybe refer to this in some way as continuous learning, right? What are the lessons? What are the blessings? How can we apply these and move these forward? And, I'm curious, Doug, how, if you align with that, how does this actually translate to how you think about the strategic planning process? Because you've talked about flexibility, you've talked about having to pivot when needed. So I'm curious how you think about this idea of resilience in that context.
Yeah, I think you're spot on in the way that you're talking about it. I think sometimes when we talk about resilience, we only talk about it as a negative.
Yeah.
Like there are bad things that are happening and resilient people can navigate bad things. I think the way that I think about it is a little bit different and probably sounds a little bit in line with you, which is it's absorbing the circumstances as they come and then treating them opportunistically.
Yeah.
And so there were nonprofits when COVID happened that were decimated by it.
Right.
And there were nonprofits that experienced stratospheric growth in the midst of COVID happening. And I don't know that it's exactly like a one-to-one causal effect, but there's at least a corollary there that some of the more resilient leaders, resilient teams, resilient cultures were able to capitalize in a moment that was in flux. But that's a negative moment. There are also moments where out of the blue, you get a $3 million check and you had no idea that it was going to come. It's really, really positive. And the question is, how do we capitalize on this $3 million check? And I think regardless of whether it's positive or negative, when we're absorbing circumstances, we're asking, going back to the learning piece, what is there to learn from this? What opportunities are there? And the very best leaders don't feel in a rush to quickly come up with the answers. They're willing to take a beat and be self-differentiated enough from the circumstance that they can make a really wise decision with their teams in the midst of that. I think that in many ways is when we're thinking about resilience and planning, that's how those things go hand in hand. We need a plan. The world is constantly changing. The way that you think things are going to be in a year are not going to be the way that exactly that you think they are going to be. Let's plan for that. And let's be the kind of leaders that can absorb those changes.
It's interesting that you say that and you use the COVID example. One of the ways that I would extend what I was talking about in terms of resilience is that now we're seeing sort of in this, I guess if we can call it like a post-COVID era, a lot of organizations are struggling because they define resilience as going back to the way things were before COVID, right? And so they're encountering a lot of resistance, right? Whereas you have organizations that have pivoted, right? Have figured out how, for example, to bring hybrid, for example, into how they deliver services, right? How they deliver programming, how they really are able to attract and retain talent from all over. And that's a different way of thinking about resilience. And so I just thought it was interesting that you use that as an example to really contextualize all of this.
Yeah, there is this, when big negative events like that happen, there's a longing to go to the pre-version of whatever that is. And I think the most resilient people are the ones who, good or bad, they absorb it and they're like, there's an opportunity here. What is it? And they have a positive predisposition to what could unfold and are not longing for what happened in the past.
I think that's a masterclass in emotional intelligence. And I think it's also just a great way to navigate life. And it's almost like the human spirit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to people that have lived through really horrible things, I think of people that I knew that had lived through the Holocaust and were able to navigate a life post World War II and actually being in the camps. Some of the most optimistic people I've ever met. It really interesting that you could find somebody that would be so shackled by trauma and tragedy, but somehow were able to navigate in a different way. And I feel like it's something that we don't talk enough about or study. But it's really, I think, incumbent upon the nonprofit sector and nonprofit leadership to explore these ideas, because each and every day is a tough day for our nonprofit leaders. And it's oftentimes very chaotic. And so, how do you flourish and not just try to survive, right? And so, wow, it's like we've gone to church today, huh? Well, Doug Paul, this has really been a great conversation. I loved what you had to say from the very get-go about what a catapult does and what does it look like? I thought it was great because in my mind, it was that medieval machine that was going to
Actually, I think that's funner, right? The medieval one. You should do that version.
Busting down every wall in front of you.
Well, it's really great. Doug Paul, managing partner and innovation strategist with Catapult. You have to go on to wearecatapult.com. It's a great website full of a lot of energizing images and thought-provoking commentary about what it looks like to be a leader and how to navigate this system. This is a fragile time for nonprofits, but maybe it always is a fragile time, and that's why we're in business. To kind of echo what Nico, our friend, said, these times of duress are not new. They are always with us.
The Lion King reminds us too, right? The circle of life, right? We have our ups and downs. Life is in contrast, right? And we have a natural resilience to navigate these if we choose to tap into it.
Yeah, I love it. Really, really powerful. Well, again, Doug Paul, it's just been delightful to have you on an episode of the Nonprofit Show. And again, do check in with catapult.com. You can access them, as I said earlier, wearecatapult.com. You can learn more about their work and their theory behind really being a successfully run nonprofit. It's just been amazing. We are successful on the Nonprofit Show because we have these amazing partners, and they are with us day in and day out. We're just coming up on our 1,300th episode. And this week we start our 6th year of broadcasting the Nonprofit Show. On those partners that support us day in and day out are Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Friday. These are the folks that just make a difference in so many communities across our globe. Gentlemen, thank you so much. This has really been a great, great conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
It's been a lot of fun. Hey, as we end each and every episode, we leave with this mantra, and it goes like this. It means something a little different to me today when I repeat it, because I'm thinking of the word resilience. But the message is to stay well so you can do well. See you again.